How far can an EV really go in a Canadian winter? We put 14 popular cars to the test to see how they fare. Come with me as I go talk to Colin Fritz, AMA's Associate Vice President of Operations, to find out how they performed. Okay, so I'm back inside now and I'm here with Colin. And you were a part of this EV winter test that we did in Ottawa and Mont-Tremblant.
Yep.
And so I'll ask you about your experience, but first I want to know how this event even came to be.
Yeah, really the event was the genesis of an idea that we had seen with one of our sister clubs out of Norway, who's been doing this for probably 10 years as real leaders in the EV space. And so they had been testing this in their market for a while, and we felt like that was a very transferable type idea for the Canadian marketplace, where we have long winters and 4 seasons, and really wanting to understand, in the Canadian landscape, how would an EV perform when it's winter out and when it's cold?
Right, and so this was a collaboration with clubs, CAA auto clubs across the country, correct?
That's correct. So all the different clubs came together to be able to get information to our members, to provide real agnostic type info, to let them know how they actually perform in a Canadian environment versus just a laboratory type test.
Yeah, and so we, like all the CAA clubs again, did a national survey not too long ago, and we asked what would be a barrier to purchasing an EV. And our members shared that one of the biggest barriers to getting an EV is that uncertainty around range loss in winter, right? So this test really addressed those concerns.
Right. I think in general sentiment, range anxiety is very real. And then in the winter, we know that typically batteries do not perform as well. So really trying to give people tangible information in what we think is a real world setting to understand how's it actually going to perform and what is my potential range loss, to be able to really understand, could an EV work for me?
Right. And so the test started out in Ottawa, and we drove the cars from Ottawa all the way to Tremblant and Quebec. Can you tell us a little bit about why this route?
The reason we did this route was, one, availability of EVs. Obviously, the Ontario market has a larger marketplace to be able to acquire EVs for the test. Also, infrastructure was the other big one. So with them being farther ahead in the amount of EVs on road, they also have better infrastructure for us to be able to not only drive them there, but also ensure that we can test the charging speeds. So it's better situated for that.
Can you tell me a little bit about how the test was structured? So there were 2 parts to it.
That's correct. So the first part was really driving the vehicle from full charge to empty and seeing how far we're actually going to get versus posted range, to understand how much of a delta there is based on the cold weather. So we drove it from Ottawa on a -10 day with snow on the ground, and we drove the vehicles within speed limit, not using cruise control. We also had to keep the climate at 21 with no heated seats.
I know, that was a little bit of a challenge.
You get used to creature comforts, and so then having to diverge wasn't the best, but
Right.
In the name of science.
Because we wanted to ensure that there was consistency throughout all the cars. So all of the vehicles and the drivers had the same parameters. So the cabin had to stay at 21 degrees.
Correct.
Heated seats were off, heated steerings were off. And then, like you said, we had to stay within that posted speed limit.
And we stuck on the same routes. It was a mixture of both primary highways, secondary, and even some, I'll use the word rural type roads, to really get an understanding of the true landscape that could exist anywhere. And there was snow on the ground. It really did feel like winter, even though, for Alberta perspective, -10 is more of a mean than a very cold temperature, but it was still enough to get a realistic picture of how it could perform.
Yeah. And then the second part of the test was the battery charging part.
That's correct. So understanding from zero, how long would it take to, one, get enough charge in 15 minutes? So how fast at a high-speed charger will it accept the energy and accept charge? And then how long to actually fully charge the vehicle? And again, posting that against what the manufacturer is stating its speed of charge was.
Right. So we'll talk a little bit about the results of those tests, but I just want to understand what your experience was like. So I was in the car with you. You drove a Tesla Model 3, and that was one of the 14 cars that took part in this. So can you tell me, were there any challenges or surprises?
A surprise is honestly like any new car, trying to figure out where all your configuration settings are. And, Teslas are really cool in one way, but everything's on the screen, right? So even the transmission, the reverse and forward, were actually on the screen, which is just different.
Yeah.
There was no signal light arms. They were built into the steering wheel. So some minor changes like that, which were a little different. So you kind of have to get used to that. But some of the benefits, frankly, is we were driving a rear-wheel drive vehicle, but with that extra weight of the battery, it actually did really well in the snow. Its performance, we didn't struggle to get traction. We didn't struggle to maintain the speeds, and the vehicle drove very nicely.
Yeah. And I actually spoke to one of the other drivers of the car, and she drove the Volkswagen. And she shared a little bit about how the EV Volkswagen was different than all the other Volkswagens that she's driven in the past. And so let's take a listen to that.
I was very excited to drive it because it was actually a car that I was interested in purchasing in the future.
Okay.
So Grey Hill SUV and very much a Volkswagen.
Yeah. Did it feel similar to other Volkswagens that you've driven?
Well, I will say that Volkswagen, for those people who are Volkswagen drivers, they know that everything's sort of similar in each car. They create a fastest media experience, as people will know. It's a little different because uh, the electric elements of right. So the first sit-in, I was trying to figure out how I started it.
It took a little bit.
It wasn't as intuitive as I would have expected for that brand. But once I made a bit of tutorial to say, you press here, this is how you switch gears or switch from drive to reverse, et cetera, et cetera. Then it was pretty much like a regular vehicle.
And so I did want to talk to some of the other drivers to find out what their experiences were and see if there were any challenges that they faced. So we'll take a listen to some of what they had to say.
When you're intentionally taking a vehicle down in power like that, there's certain things that I think about that most people wouldn't, and that's the blind curves, you dying on a hill, a downhill right after going over the crash.
Yeah.
So yeah, it was really nerve-wracking to me. When we got out of it and kind of got on a long stretch of road, I'm like, die here, please die here, because we ended up doing about 20 kilometers further to get the battery at zero.
I thought it was a great experience overall. The one thing that I didn't know, I had never experienced before, was going into turtle mode, which was the whole point of the test drive, so bringing down the EV to 0% battery. I actually, obviously, and fortunately, have never been in an EV where it's gone to 0%, so I wasn't sure what to expect. And honestly, it turned out to be a really great experience. Came to a nice slow stop, nothing crazy. Everything was all safe and sound, so that was definitely a takeaway from this.
So when your car came to a complete stop, what was that experience like?
You know what? Honestly, it was a lot smoother than I expected. I knew it was going to obviously come to a gradual stop in a safe way. We were just going to halt on the road.
Yeah.
But what was surprising to me is how far the car actually went after it told me it was going into turtle mode. We probably got an extra, just from regenerative braking, probably an extra 30 to 35 kilometers of driving.
That's a lot.
And that was with the car basically on 0% completely.
Yeah.
So I thought we were going to stop right when we went into turtle mode, and we didn't. We would hit hills and go back up to 1% and then go down, and we basically cruise. Now, that's not to say those 35 kilometers were like right at the speed limit. We were definitely on the shoulder, like going pretty slow at times and then faster, slower. So it was inconsistent at best, but it gives you a little bit of peace of mind. To get somewhere
safe.
Yeah, that you can kind of survey the situation and come to a complete stop safely.
Was there anything surprising that you were during the drive?
Yes, indeed. Surprising was like between the highway and the city. For example, in the city, we've been able to, for example, in the 51st kilometers, we lost 80 kilometers of rate. Okay, but in the next 51, okay, it was like more on the highway, and on the highway we lost a bit less than before, because we lost 40 kilometers of range, but we get 50 kilometers in the middle. Okay. So it was like a bit balancing about that, and also when your car stopped, okay, it was in the middle of an hill, okay, and like we were waiting for the tow truck to be there, and I just tried to start again the vehicle to see if it could work again. It worked again, and I've been able to use it again to continue to grow.
One of the common things that seemed to come up was when the cars got to 0% batteries, everyone, I think, had this expectation that it would completely come to a stop at that point, but that didn't happen.
No, it was actually quite interesting because it's not normal behavior to drive a car knowingly to zero and watch that happen. So that's a bit of a change just in your own behavior. But frankly, I guess our expectation is, like anything, when my cell phone battery gets to zero, my cell phone turns off right away.
Right.
What we found with the Tesla is it got to zero and we kept driving and we actually saw no performance loss. And we ended up getting an additional 25 kilometers out of the vehicle, which, much like the E-Light on a traditional gasoline vehicle, once it gets to E and even at zero, there is an allowance for kilometers there, a bit of an unknown. This one was just more than we expected.
Yeah, so I do recall once we hit that 0% mark, we were just like, okay, everyone get ready. There were 3 of us in the car and we're just like, it's going to happen any minute now.
Right.
And I think we went for about 30 minutes.
Yeah. We kept going and going. And, obviously you don't want to break down on a highway if you can. So we had done a few options where we pulled into some parking lots to just try and see if the vehicle would die, but it would not die. And so we kept going, and then we ended up dying on a bridge, which, again, not ideal, but
for the sake of science.
For science, that's right.
And there were safety precautions that were in place, and so all of the vehicles were equipped with the cones. And then we also had flares. Yeah,
we had cones, flares to be able to create a safe scene. We also had the CAA group was there supporting us. The tow truck got there in like 15 minutes. They were tracking where we were going to be able to ensure that they could, rescue us really quickly.
Right. And so I want to share a little bit about what that process was for anyone who wasn't there. But the cars left in groups of 4s. And each car had a team lead that tracked all the vehicles so that when the cars did come to a stop, they knew exactly where we were and they could quickly send either a tow truck, a mobile charging unit, and also a rescue vehicle to get the passengers out and safely to a destination.
Exactly. It's almost like a typical roadside assistance kind of scenario for sure.
So across the board, the cars lost between 14 and 39% of their range. Was this surprising at all?
I think it was of huge surprise to everyone. These aren't marginal little results. The range of results is actually quite staggering in trying to understand performance. Like a 15% range, I think that most consumers would be okay with. When you're talking about 40%, that is quite the delta from what you expected the range to be when you purchased a vehicle like that.
Right. So we did take a lunch break because it was quite the journey. So we stopped, and when we stopped for our lunch break, the Tesla had about 40% of battery left. And then once we started back and got on the road, we were a little surprised at how quickly it went from 40 to 30%. So I think this comes back to that idea of preconditioning your car to help minimize that range loss.
Yeah, I think that's part of it. I think much like a gas tank too, the top half always seems to last longer than the bottom half. And so part of it is we stopped and it's cold out. So then rewarming that battery up is going to take some power away from it, which is why we would have seen some of that loss there. A lot of times if you're using some settings like preconditioning when it's plugged in, it's using energy from the charger to keep the battery warm so that the battery itself is not spending energy, keeping it warm and propelling the vehicle.
Right. Another interesting thing about that lunch break was, so we were around the 50% mark, we were at 40%, but some of the vehicles were kind of at the end of their journey at that point.
For sure. So we had started the test and assumed you're going into lunch. Well, we're at 40 and, Tesla's been in this game a while. Everyone's going to be around the same range. So then when you're sitting across from the guy driving the Volvo and he is telling us that he's at 17%, and we're calculating the number of hours we have left to drive and the number of minutes that he had left to drive.
And again, all of these vehicles have different range, battery capacities. And so the importance of this isn't necessarily to say one car is better than the other, but it's looking at your driving needs and saying, okay, how much range would I need on a daily basis? Or if you do longer trips, what range would you need?
I think really it comes down to is exactly that use case. Because frankly, while maybe the Volvo didn't get the performance that we expected, first off, it was a beautiful car.
It was.
It was the one. And even at 40% loss, it did 250 kilometers. And so when we think about the typical use of a vehicle for anybody, 90 to 95% of your travel is between home, work, grocery store, whatever it is. that's more than enough kilometers. So then it really comes down to is what are you using it for? And is it 2% of the time I'm driving to Banff or Jasper? And then it really comes down to pre-planning. Where is infrastructure? Where is charge so that I can pull over and make sure I get there safe?
Yeah. So speaking of charge, the second part of the test took place the following day, and it was minus 25 for this test, and this was the battery testing part of it. So again, you mentioned that the goal was to see how much charge we could get in 15 minutes, and then also how long it took the cars to go from 10% to 80%. So the Tesla did perform the best in this one. It took it gained the most kilometers in 15 minutes, and then it was followed not too far behind by the Chevy Silverado.
That's correct.
So can you tell me again, what was the benefit of doing this?
I think for a lot of people, especially if you're long distance traveling, the idea isn't that you're necessarily stopping at a high-speed charger and going from 0 or 10% all the way to 80. It's really about getting you enough charge to your next logical stop, because that first bit of charging is usually where you're getting the quickest amount of energy in the fastest amount of time, right? So what we wanted to understand is how quick is quick and how much distance will I get in 15 minutes, how far can I get? And really knowing that there is some variance. And by doing it outside in cold weather, also very realistic that it's possible in minus 24, I'm making a trip, and how much energy and how much time am I spending at the charger to be able to get to my next stop point?
Yeah. So our viewers can see the full results of the testing on our website, and we will link to where you can find that in our show notes. But is there anything else that you want to share with our members about this test? Any hopes for future plans to do this again?
I mean, this is phase one, like anything. I think one thing we've learned through all of this is that there's a definite use case for EVs in this province and can be used for the right people, right? I think that this isn't going to go away and we're going to see growth. I think it just depends on what you need the vehicle for. And really, future state is this has been one test. I think our hope is to start to do this more often as new vehicles come out and new model years and more infrastructure. Really, this is a dynamically changing market, and we want to continue to be able to provide really bias-free information about how it performs. So our hope would be able to do this now in another region of Canada, in another winter period, to be able to understand if performance looks similar, has the technology gotten better, or how it's really going to perform overall.
And I know CAA is hoping that eventually we can have Canadian-made labeling for electric vehicles.
Right.
Is that?
I think part of it, I think we need, the testing standards that are used in EVs are a bit antiquated and really focused on how a traditional gas-powered vehicle would work. So I think there needs to be rethinking for the average consumer to understand what is true performance and what can you expect to get in maybe extremes. Hot heat, also not great on a battery, cold weather, and understand my range of performance to ensure I'm better informed on my purchase decision.
All right. Thanks, Colin.
Yeah.
Well, I hope you enjoyed this special episode for the EV Life podcast. We'd love to hear your thoughts on how you thought this test went. So if you want to check out the results online and come and weigh in the conversation, you can do so in the EV Life group on the AMA mobile app. And of course, make sure that you're subscribed to the podcast so you know when the next episode is out. We're getting close to launching season 5 of the EV Life podcast, so we'll have more interviews coming your way pretty soon. I'll talk to you then.
Thank you so much for joining us for another episode of the EV Life podcast. Make sure that you're subscribed so you never miss an episode. And if you'd like to join the conversation, you can always do so in the EV Life group on the AMA mobile app. We'll talk to you in the next episode.